Welcome to a new episode of Alternative Indian Media. In this episode, we will discuss how the British Empire sowed the seeds of animosity between India and China through the implementation of Palmerston Policy. It seems, the current ruling political establishment of India has shown an inclination in accepting and extending this dangerous policy. Palmerston Policy is a topic in itself and is closely related to the 19th century Opium Wars that the British Empire waged upon the Chinese. A detailed discussion will lengthen this episode. Therefore, in this episode, we will touch upon Lord Palmerston and his foreign policy in brief. A more detailed discussion on Opium War would be done in a future episode. Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston, was twice Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in the mid-19th century during the reign of Queen Victoria. Palmerston dominated British foreign policy during the period between the years 1830 to 1865, when Britain stood at the height of its imperial power. In simple terms, Palmerston's policy was aimed to subdue Russia, China, and India through the exploitation of land, resources and manpower of the other forces in Asia and Eurasian region. Palmerston adopted a ruthless approach in order to safeguard the interests of the British Empire. By the middle of 18th century, British East India Company had planted its foot firmly on Indian soil. British East India Company would buy silk, tea, spices, herbs, cotton, timber from India and China, and would sell these items in the European markets. They realized that their profits would be many folds higher if they could sell opium and opiate substances in China. Brits started the opium cultivation in India in the early phases of 18th century. And once they realized the immense business potential of opium trade in China, they would force the farmers in Bengal, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh to start farming opium. This would cause famines in these places as more and more farmlands would be used in opium cultivation. Lakhs of Indians would die in these famines. Their strategy was simple: they would produce opium in India while subjugating and exploiting the Indian farmers, sell this opium in China, particularly along the Chinese coastline, make huge profit, and at the same time, get the Chinese society addicted to opium. Brits understood that China too was extremely wealthy and resource-rich, and the Brits wanted to loot and plunder this vast Chinese wealth. But they were faced with an uphill task. Chinese empire was extremely powerful, and its subjects were loyal to the emperor. Therefore, Brits decided to destroy the Chinese society, particularly the Chinese youth, by getting them addicted to opium. As a result, opium trade became an integral part of British loot and plunder model. Throughout the 18th century, Chinese emperor would prohibit opium trade, peddling, and consumption of opium through various edicts. But this illegal trade would continue unabated. By the end of 18th century, Brits had raised a robust infrastructure to support this opium trade. In order to create opium addicts, British Freemason Grand Lodge would set up several subsidiary lodges all across Far East. These secret societies, such as Chinese Triad Society, or the Society of Heaven and Earth, Order of the Swastika, etc., were involved in opium trade under the guise of Freemasonry. All these set the stage for the First and Second Opium Wars in the mid-19th century. By that time, opium addict Chinese society was vulnerable. Both these expeditions were led by Lord Palmerston, who would bring the French and other European powers together to fight the Chinese. British East India Company would hire a whopping 250,000 soldiers from the Indian kingdoms as mercenaries, and with this combined military strength, Brits were able to defeat the Chinese emperor in the next 30 years in a series of opium wars which started with the First Opium War of 1839. So, what did we learn? Brits first took control of India, then used India's land, resources and manpower to subdue China, while destroying India at the same time. And this is how South Asia was enslaved. Over the next 150 years, West would use this Palmerston policy repeatedly. Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski nearly refined and perfected this art. Radicalization of Afghanistan and subsequent Talibanization of Afghan society was aimed to destabilize USSR on one hand and destabilize India on the other hand through Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. In reality, Pakistan-sponsored terrorism was an act of America-sponsored terrorism. This radicalization of Afghan society, and the subsequent civil war throughout the 90s completely ruined Afghanistan. Pakistan too got radicalized, and its development and welfare would be stalled. India's welfare and development would get retarded. But more importantly, Pakistan-sponsored terrorism and proxy war would bring in socio-political and socio-religious subversion in India. This subversion is chiefly responsible for the rise of current ruling political establishment of India. And the current ruling political establishment would reject neutral foreign policy and would start fostering a pro-Western foreign policy. There is a push to integrate Indian armed forces into NATO. In 2017, India signed COTSA, or Countering American Adversary Through Sanctions Act, a United States federal law that is designed to impose sanctions on Iran, North Korea, and Russia. This is in spite of the fact that Donald Trump called COTSA seriously flawed and Iran and Russia being India's trusted allies. Chinese people and the society didn't forget the damage done by the British India and the Indian soldiers acting as mercenaries under the British command during these Opium Wars. Whenever Indian foreign policy become pro-Western, Chinese leadership sense danger. All Indochina clashes is the fallout of the enmity whose seeds were planted during the 19th century Opium Wars. Chinese and even the Russians do not trust India under Western influence. In words of Lord Palmerston, we have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow. Speech, House of Commons, March 1, 1848. Thanks for watching this episode. Kindly share this episode and subscribe to this channel.